I suppose the first question is that presents, but it's both a gift because your structure is already established for you. You have to get all this into a day, but also technically, it really presents a problem. And it's fascinating to watch how effortlessly you move from the description of something in the past to another moment, very ordinary moment where she's brought tea out to the table. The cat has come and sat on top of the cow, the sort of cow that's in the garden. And but that the ordinary day is, I suppose, punctuated by events from the past, but the effortless way in which you can go back to the ordinary day. I suppose the question would be, did this involve a lot of rewriting, planning, structuring, working out on charts what time it is? Because what time it is, where the sun is, where the light is essential in the book.
Well, Colm, you're very canny because I think only another novelist would really understand at that level. And I'm glad you say, about moving effortlessly, because I can assure you when I was writing it, I was moving effortfully from one thing to the other. And I think often when you're writing something, you think, oh, this will be easy because of whatever, it'll be straightforward because of whatever. But when you start to write it, you realize there are actually real difficulties hardwired into the idea. And this was one of them. For example, I had never really written anything before that wasn't in chapters, and a chapter is very easy to manage. And I couldn't, if I couldn't make this material work in chapters because it would have broken it up too much. You need the whole day just to flow along. But as a writer, then it was much harder to sort of manage in that way. And it's really interesting as well, you mentioned Mrs. Dalloway, because I was really struggling at one stage when I was writing this. And I phoned my editor in Faber at that time, Hannah Griffith, and had a chat with her. And she said, I told her a little, and it's quite unusual for me to do that. I don't know that I've ever done that much before. But I chatted to her, and she said, go back and have a look at Mrs. Dalloway, which I did. And again, that was very helpful because possibly, I can't remember exactly, I probably had been trying to force it into chapters, and that was part of the problem. So it was interesting to read a novel, as you say, like a diurnal novel. I didn't know that term either, but a novel that sort of flows, just takes place on the one day. And the other thing I noticed that was very helpful was Mrs. Dalloway has a much faster pace than this book. And what I was trying to do was write something that moves much more slowly. There are lots of different characters in Mrs. Dalloway, and Woolf can move from the consciousness of one person to the other with incredible speed. And it's magnificent, to see how you can go from one person to the next, maybe 3 or 4 people standing near each other. And I knew then I didn't want to do that. I was doing something different, but Mrs. Dalloway gave me something to work against, if I could put it that way. It was over one day, so that was helpful. But I knew that my pacing and whatever, but it really helped to get going again then on that. And so technically I found it a very difficult book to put together, but I stuck with it until it took a long time, but I stuck with it until I was happy.
I think it might be easy to say that your interest in this novel, in domestic surface, in the texture of things, what tables are like, where exactly the seat in the garden is, or the description of flowers, for example, that a lot of this has connections to Mrs. Dalloway, but actually it has much closer connections to a novel of your own, an earlier novel, a novel I really love called Remembering Light and Stone, which is so brilliant about Italian light and how light falls and what exactly a surface is like. So that it's just too easy, I think, to make the Woolf connection. She took the idea from Virginia Woolf, and of course she used all these things. She took the idea from Deirdre Madden, from a novel like Remembering Light and Stone. But I think the Ulysses connection, there's one particular thing from Ulysses that I think really matters in your novel. I'm not suggesting you took it from Ulysses, but it's really important with a novel like this in Ireland that you set it in the summer, that you set it on the longest day of the year, which,
Right.
Bloomsday is almost the longest day of the year. But in other words, if you
Mm-hmm.
don't do that, you're going to have rain, frost, wind. You're going to have an early evening lighting the fire. You're going to have all those things. And instead, in this novel, Molly Fox, you're going to have an expansive day in the same way as Joyce does.
I hadn't thought about that at all. And I don't even know that I would agree with you because I'm very domesticated. That probably comes through in the work. And I can see how you could set a whole novel in the house on a wet day and people sort of come and then you're remembering, because a lot of the action takes place, in London and elsewhere and in her childhood. And it's and again, this is a thing that made it tricky to write. The action takes place over a day, but it moves out to other places and it goes back over many years as well. And I think you could certainly do that over a winter's day when
Yeah.
people are coming. So that hadn't occurred to me. I was conscious once I started consciously thinking of it as about novels set over a single day. Obviously, I thought about Ulysses as well, but I didn't find it as useful for many, for many reasons, as it was to think about Mrs. Dalloway. Like when I'm teaching creative writing, I often say to the students, once you're into a work, and particularly maybe if you're having a few problems, it's a good idea to have a sort of model to work against. And it's not that you're trying to write the same book, but you're sort of looking at it and saying, well, this is, I don't know, like a novel written in the first person. It's, well, in this instance, shall we say, it's told in the first person. The action takes place over one day, but there's a lot of memories. What book can I find? And as I say, like for me, the reading Wolf and thinking, okay, I want something with a much slower pace than that, and it's different in many, many ways as well. But just to give you something to compare what you're trying to do. And it might even, when you're writing, you might even look at another book and think, well, this is what I'm trying to do, but I know I'm not going to be able to do it. Or
Yeah.
it's not a good match for my idea. So sort of test it out. And that's why reading is so important, because you got that knowledge of other books and structures and forms, and you can sort of test out your own ideas against that
Yeah.
and find something maybe that's helpful to push it on.
One of the features of the novel, which is really very interesting at the moment, is the way in which it uses the North, the South, and England as almost a place that the characters can move very freely and easily between. I think it's a world. Maybe medicine is another area that might be the case where a doctor could so easily move from Dublin to London. A nurse could very easily do that. But within the arts, for example, the way in which an actor, we just think of so many actors based in London,
Oh, yeah.
often in Dublin, a playwright, an Irish playwright living in London,
Mhm.
but the show's on in Dublin. And so that your characters move, again, I'm going to use the word effortlessly. It isn't as though they say, oh, it was so difficult because it was on in London and then I had to come to Dublin with the same play. What am I going to do with my accent? The accents in the novel, the characters' own accents and own affects are capable of shifting so much that going from Dublin to London is not actually a big move. Um,
Mhm.
and so it's a novel that deals with the two islands um, in a way that suggests great freedom of movement, great ease, and it gives the characters a sort of openness to life that they're not sort of stuck as Irish people in London, and they're not stuck as Irish people in Ireland. It's hard to think of another recent novel that does that with the same, it isn't explained, it isn't dealt out as though it's the theme of the novel. It's just there
Mm.
in the novel, but I think it gives you great freedom in the novel to move between, say, the three places. If you wanted to divide Ireland into two in that way.
Yes, I see what you mean. Again, I suppose I'd have to disagree with you because at the moment I'm spending a lot of time between the Republic and the North, and in all sorts of practical reasons, for all sorts of practical reasons, like the border is still massively inconvenient in all sorts of ways. And I wouldn't feel that it was as fluid in that way. The thing about the accents within it, I wanted to explore that a lot because I think it has to do a lot with identity and how some people keep their accent and how some people consciously change it to fit in wherever they are. And it's also related to the whole idea of being an actor and, being able to. And Molly Fox's voice is very important. She has a very beautiful voice. And that, how someone's skill as an actor is very closely connected to that and the ability maybe to use. There's more to it than just accents. When I was researching this book, I remember I read an awful lot about the theatre, and one of the things I read was a book by Tyrone Guthrie, and he said that he always advised actors to work on their voice and not really to worry about their body. It didn't really matter if you weren't very handsome or very beautiful or whatever, but the voice was the real instrument, and that was what you were using, and that you could actually work on that and develop that. And I thought that was a very interesting point. And I don't believe it was something I had thought about
Yeah.
until then.
There's a moment where Molly sees her mother, and we watch her. I mean, later the protagonist describes her almost performing the scene. But in the first moment, there's a moment of dialogue, which is pure magic, where she just simply says to her, "You're to leave Fergus be." And in that, you can hear an Irish intonation. You can hear the shot. You're to leave, not you must leave, or you should leave, or I want you to leave. You're to leave Fergus be.
Mm.
And I saw, while I'm watching her, is under pressure. She becomes a different person with a different sort of tone, less
Yeah.
cosmopolitan, less anglicized, as it were, and suddenly back into an Irish sound.
Yeah. Well, it's this whole idiom of speech that is so important as well. And I think that this whole thing of like accent and idiom and very particular words that somebody would use, I think that's a lot of the secret of making speech or dialogue, be it on the stage or on the page. I think that's a very crucial thing to sort of understand that that element of speech.
Um, you must have enjoyed the idea, and certainly the reader does, that it's Molly Fox's birthday, but we're not going to have a party. And that it's someone living, and it's not exactly ghostly, but someone moving into her house with full permission, sleeping in her bed, going downstairs, opening her books, looking at her things. So it's a lovely idea for a novel where the main character is both absent and even more present than if she were actually there.
Yes, some readers have told me that they found something slightly creepy in all of that. And they didn't like the narrator at all, who remains unnamed, because they felt that there was something slightly creepy about her and the way she perceives Molly Fox. And I can understand that. But I think what I was trying to get at is maybe how complex a friendship can be as well. It's not just completely straightforward. You can be when you're very, very close to people, it's not just a question of, well, I like you and you like me. There's much more going on. It becomes almost like family, where there is all this there's lots of different layers to it. When people really understand you very well. And I was always trying to work for something like that. Sort of complex and deep and very, very nuanced in the relationship amongst all these people, like with Andrew, their friend as well. So yes.
And I suppose what you're writing about are three different relationships to home. And home as that word that's ironic, that shifts, that could mean several things. But I think there's a really beautiful moment in the book. I think you've worked hard, to earn this moment where when your narrator goes back home, as it were, goes back to the north, happens to find herself there. She doesn't deliberately go home, and she writes a sentence, and it is, I suppose it goes without saying that I headed for home. I suppose it goes without saying that I headed for home. What I'm hearing is something like that beautiful ending of Brian Friel's Faith Healer, where, he makes his way home. And,
Yes.
but I suppose it goes without saying, that in other words, yeah, this is the journey actually she's been wanting to have. And then she drove over to, and then there's some lovely, lovely sentences like, that is, I drove over to where my family lived. Like, don't give us the emotion. Don't give us the worry. Just the sentence will be enough. We'll know it's not especially fraught, but it's not especially easy. And then going by the most circuitous route. And then it's Deirdre Madden with light. That you don't do it all the time. And obviously the light in Dublin, the garden light. But now you have this light that's this slanted home northern light. The light deepened and intensified, a rich gold that lit up the landscape, the fading trees and the hedges with their bright berries, the drenched, flooded fields. And again, I'm feeling that evocation of landscape that you can get in, especially Midlands or sort of North Midlands landscape in Ireland that you get beautifully in John McGahern. And then you move. Watch what you do now. So, I mean, after the flooded fields, you could easily describe a bird, a bush, the sky, or even a feeling. But you don't do that. You move into the riskiest sentence. To me, it was a tragic place. To Andrew, the friend, it has always simply been wretched. I mean, these are difficult words to use in a novel, but you've earned them by the way in which the landscape comes up, tragic and wretched. And then you move further down and you say, this was why the peace process wasn't working, that the whole population was locked in a trance of grief that they didn't break out of because it defined them, it made them feel real. And I honestly went, oh, I didn't think that was coming. This is not, as it were, a political book. It's not a troubles novel. It's not all the, and suddenly there it is, coming in like the slanted light itself from the landscape. And it isn't dwelt on. It isn't dramatized. It's there like a drum sound at certain points with the death of Andrew's brother. But it's really effective. It's very, very powerful. It really made me stop. And what I suppose I always want to know
Thank
is,
you.
did this come as a first draft? Did this come simply? Did you have more around it? Did you cut? So I just want to know technically, could you help us if we wanted to write like that? How would we do it?
I have to say, Colm, I can't remember writing that particular part. I do remember it was very, I was very focused on this idea of like she comes home for another reason and then she goes home. She'd said she'll go home to her family, but in a way she can't face them. And I think a thing that interested me very much in her relationship to that was, again, how you can be very close and very distant at the same time. The life that she has embraced for herself is quite different. She still loves her family very much, but she's living a very different type of life. And the only person within her family that she feels really understands is her brother. And she goes to him rather than going to sort of the married family members who are living a much more sort of conventional life. But certainly when I write about the North, and it's in pretty much every book, I think, like I have a novel like One by One in the Darkness, which is explicitly about the Troubles, and that's the whole subject. But even in like a novel like this, as you've said, like there's the instance of Andrew's brother, there's the scene you've just described. It's always there in some way because I think it's sort of even yet sort of inescapably part of the experience of certainly people of my generation who lived through all of that. And you're still sort of thinking about it, or it's still part of the whole experience of just being here. So So I think that's as much as I can helpfully say.
I think if we wanted to divide Irish writers in groups of two, or Irish people in groups of two, and this may be an urban-rural thing, and maybe something that you and I have in common is people who would actually literally know priests, have some in the family or have some connected to the family or have friendships, that it would be a normal part of life that someone would become a priest and stay a priest. And I know writers who, including friends of ours, who would have absolutely no concept. That'd be the furthest thing away from a priest. And so the question then is, I have a priest in a novel, and it really comes up quite a lot. Someone said, did you never think of, and the answer is no, I didn't. In other words, did you ever think of dramatizing what happened to many priests, and what happened, that many priests began to have victims rather than indeed congregations? And priests went to jail, and there were, with all the sex abuse cases, with all the corruption, with all the horrible stuff that happened. And you put a priest in a novel, and you think, if anyone thinks I am going to dramatize something that's so ugly and so horrible, and that is there no other way I can have a priest in a novel? And so when it comes to Father Tom in this book, I'm really fascinated by how you handle this, and by how you have her in that I've just described. She finds herself in the north. She finds herself driving back to where she's from, basically across the north. And she's in this beautifully evoked landscape, and she goes to see her brother, who's living in a parochial house in a small parish in the north, and he's a Catholic priest. He's called Father Tom. Could you just talk to us about building that character of Father Tom?
Well, one of the things I find very interesting about the character of Father Tom in this novel is, I think I've only met one reader or critic who has understood or said to me, well, he's a priest, isn't he? And there's nothing sinister or strange about him. People seem to find it impossible to take him at face value. And it's because of what you've just been talking about. They're sort of reading, there must be a subtext of abuse. He must be doing something with Molly. He must be doing something he isn't supposed to be doing. And part of the reason he's in there is, I did want to talk a little bit about or explore the idea of religion and belief. Andrew, for example, like Tom is a priest. And Molly is very troubled, and she can see that because he's a good priest, he can maybe sort of help her, and he has a good understanding of the world. But he can sort of help her, and he's also very interested in the theatre, and they have a friendship. Andrew, their other friend, is sort of rabidly anti-religion and has no time for it whatsoever. And how you deal with things coming from life, coming from these different angles, and how people who know each other having these different views on belief or religion. And by religion, I mean a much more sort of complex thing than just, talking about organized religion, trying to get to the really essence of what is it about. And as I say, I was really struck that a lot of people either didn't seem to see that, or didn't want to seem to see it, or didn't connect with it. Because I also had a priest in my family, and I was very aware of how much priests give. Not even now, you would see on the news sometimes when there's been something terrible happen, like maybe a terrible car crash or murder or something like that, and the priest is still in Ireland, in the countryside, like the spokesperson for the community. And I was aware from the priest in my family of sometimes he had to go to really terrible things. And I've worked something of that into the story, like having to go to road accidents, having to go to the scenes of suicides and things like that. And there are still priests, obviously, doing this every day of the week. And those people are just being dismissed as if, they're just priests, and they're giving so much in that way. And it's a very tough calling in that way. When it's done properly, it's a very, very tough calling. And I wanted to explore that a bit. Um, and like genuinely explore it, and as I say, match up that character, and I'm trying to make him a wee bit more complex and interesting, like the sort of person somebody like Molly would befriend, if you see what I mean. Um, so he's not just like a very simple
Yeah.
country priest in a certain way. He's so to develop him as a character in that way. And I just found it very interesting. Like, I've never had a discussion like I've discussed this maybe once with an academic who brought this up with me, who was working on my work and came to see me. But generally, I even think common people aren't interested. like Father Tom is the character in the novel people least want to say anything about. And he is in some ways a more minor character, but he's very important in relation to
Yeah.
the whole setup and the other characters.
I think that's what characterizes your work, the idea of not just thoughtfulness and tact, but the idea that if there's something, it is a temptation to go into very colorful and sensational material and see what you can do with it, having taken your cue from the newspapers. You will never go there. You will always find a different route. And the different route will approach the truth, not from an angle, but actually quietly head on, going directly towards that. Tom that it isn't a triangle. In fact, there's a fourth. There's a fourth point, and it's Tom, and he's there are four people who are more or less living on their own, and he seems the loneliest. But he also against Andrew, and again, it's fascinating, Deirdre, that you don't bother with the Protestant Catholic divide thing. It's not Andrew and Tom versus each other as Catholic or Protestant. It's actually two ways of approaching faith and unbelief, and it's two different ways of living almost. But in a way, they're both dealing with spiritual matters. Andrew as an art
Mhm.
historian, and Tom as a parish priest. But it is very subtle, and it's very subtly handled. And I think all your readers and all your novels are always grateful for that sort of absolute sort of purity of vision. However, I'm coming to the complexity of that the protagonist, the storyteller, we have a problem. And it's a problem I think that you beautifully created for us, which is that she's not simple, and don't trust her. And there's certain, and it isn't, I don't find it creepy. I mean, somebody could say, especially people who live on their own, and someone's coming to stay, they would want the other person to actually inhabit the house. That's not a creepy thing. But she does say at a certain point, I know who I am. And you read that and you think, that's an interesting thing for someone to say about themselves. Well, let's watch her. And you're watching her in Trinity, and you realize she's in Trinity College, and you realize that, of course, she's a dosser. She isn't studying for her degree. She's doing other things, but she's watching this boy, Andrew, and he's an absolute swat, and he's in the library all the time. But you realize, of course, she's watching Andrew with some sort of desire, and she won't spell it out because it's her story and she's controlling it. And you think, well, did they never? And then you think, no, what's happening is that she's not disclosing. She just is withholding a certain piece of information from us and indeed from Molly Fox. And then it comes to a moment where she actually has to say it. And you go, oh, you did? And you say, no, because you realize, but you see, I lied to Molly. And you go, oh, you lied to Molly, meaning you lied to you lied to us too. And so I found that tension between the story and the storyteller really
Mm.
very well handled in the book. And so I just wonder if you could talk to us. Oh, there's another wonderful moment where she talks about that she herself is really an expert in creating non-places. In other words, that if she makes a room, it's never cozy. It's never, in the way Molly Fox creates interior spaces, our protagonist is not capable of making such spaces. And it doesn't mean you judge her, but it's a very telling detail about her, her moving between two countries, her moving between, in a way, that the home she comes from and the home she's now coming almost like an intruder for the day. So she's a very complex figure.
Well, that was the hope, to have somebody telling this who was who was very complex and couldn't be taken at face value, and also to try and reflect the way people change over their lives. Like when these characters meet first, they're all very young, like Molly's a very young actor, Andrew and the narrator at university together. And I wanted to try and make their characters sort of change and develop over the years in a way that you would believe that would be plausible. A thing I remember when I was writing it, and I can't now remember, oddly enough, which was the missing element. When I was writing it to begin with, there were the three main characters, the narrator, Molly, and Andrew. And two of them had siblings, and one of them didn't. And as I continued writing, I realised there was something about the book that was a bit unbalanced. It was sort of calling out for something, some kind of symmetry. And I realised it was that you had to have these three main characters, and the three of them each had a sibling. So there's Molly's brother Fergus, there is Andrew's brother Billy, and there is the narrator's brother Tom. And they're all like important. They're not central characters, but it does give it. And once I twigged that, I knew it was very pleasing, because you've got these three main characters, and then you've got these three siblings. Each of them have, but it shouldn't be so blatant that you're very conscious of that when you're reading it. It just sort of underpins it and sort of shapes out the work very well. The funny thing is, I now can't remember who was the third.
Okay.
Whether it was Fergus came in later. It was fairly early on when I was writing it. I understood I needed this, but whether it was Tom or whether it was Fergus or whether it was Billy, I actually can't remember. Do you find this, Colm, when you finished writing things and people say, like, why did you do that? I think, I cannot remember writing this scene or writing this work or what I had thought I wanted to do at this point.
Absolutely.
Because what you've actually written sort of blots out the plan.
Yes. And things come to you suddenly from a side. There was something else I was going to ask you. It's another thing that we have in common is that we're both outsiders in Dublin. That both of us have lived long years in Dublin without especially becoming sort of Dublin, writing the city. Like, in other words, it's not as though I could write a Roddy Doyle novel. And I don't imagine you're going to start either. But this is a Dublin novel in the sense that there's one of the things you notice in Ulysses, for example, that the center of the city is so small that the chances of meeting someone twice is quite high. And Bloom is always seeing someone that he saw earlier on, just there and there and there. And it's filled with what looked like coincidences, but in fact are just aspects of a city that really, for the top of Grafton Street, the upper part of O'Connell Street. And so this novel is not just set in Dublin, but it's set in a city in which coincidences occur, in which people meet by accident, in which Stephen's Green becomes a sort of, it's called a magic place because of the way in which people can meet. But you do handle that business of the small center and the fact that the sort of things that you need for a novel can naturally happen in Dublin. In other words, that she can meet Molly's mother in a hotel. That it could be. I mean, I can think about 3 hotels it could be. But that's actually a central aspect of Dublin, the same way as it wouldn't work in London.
Yes, it's a much smaller city than London or Paris or New York. And I think one meets people one knows less and less in Dublin, but that's only since maybe the pandemic. Because I think people come into town less and less, and I think that's true in other cities as well. Like, I know it's the case in Belfast. Lots of people tell me, "Oh, I never go into the centre of Belfast now," but I totally agree with you. It's Dublin. The centre of Dublin remains very small, and you are very likely, even now, to see or bump into someone around the place, and that's very helpful because you can do that in a novel without people thinking, That's a ridiculous
I think
coincidence.
it really works in this book.
Yeah.
And I know that this that anyone reading this book will have plenty of questions and things. I just want to thank you for putting the word tea chest back into the novel, because we're not seeing tea chests anymore. And I love the wigwam of briquettes. So I have all these notes of, that soon people are not going to know what that is. So it's lovely to have it. Trying to light a fire with a wigwam of briquettes. And so now that I've got tea chest off my chest, thank you very much, Deirdre. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. It was such a pleasure reading the book. It was absolutely.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Colm, for asking me to do this. And thanks very much to all the book club people as well. Thank you ever so much.